Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It's the day before the Canelo Crawford fight. They haven't yet done the weigh-ins, which could sway odds one way or the other. Let's talk about it. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, let me just say right now as I make this video, the odds on bovada.lv are a plus 150 for Terence Crawford. Plus 150. In other words, the betting market is giving Crawford a 40% chance of winning this fight. My advice to bettors is to look hard at this line. Right? Stare at it. Check on it every few hours. I believe the late money, which I think is going to be substantial, the late money is going to pour in on the Canelo side of the play. This fight is mispriced. You know it's mispriced. Right? Crawford, great fighter. When I first started looking at films, I thought Crawford was going to win this fight. Then I had to back away for a moment, and I had to actually think about the situation. Right? What exactly are they fighting for? Who's the heavier fighter? What's the situation? Right, folks? None of that favors Crawford. None of it. You know this fight is mispriced. You know Canelo should be much more favored. When you think about the fact that 2 fights ago, Crawford was fighting at 147 against Errol Spence. The betting market viewed that fight as a jump ball. Right? Both guys were given better than 40% chances of winning that fight. Right? You considered that fight to be a jump ball. Now here we are, 2 fights later. Let's strip away all the other facts. 2 fights later. Here we are, and we are 154, that's 1. 160, that's 2. We are 3 weight classes up. Right? 3 weight classes up. Crawford is fighting one of the best in the sport pound for pound. Now, none of us think Canelo is perfect. Canelo, in fact, has 2 losses. I want people to think about who those 2 losses were to. Right? Floyd Mayweather, who, and this is not a fan club site, Mayweather, who had better feet than Terence Crawford. Faster hands than Terence Crawford. Better defense than Terence Crawford. Right? One of Canelo's losses is to Mayweather, an outlier athlete. The other loss is to a bigger man, a 175-pound champion, Dimitri Bivol, who has enough of a back foot game to give away 3 rounds consecutively to Arthur Beterbiev, in full belief that because he won the first 3 rounds of the fight, he would be able to close strong and win on the scorecards. Right, folks? That's who Canelo has lost to. Right? We know the politics favors Canelo, because Crawford comes into this fight having none of the belts at 168. In other words, in terms of moral authority, William Skull had more moral authority because he had a title at 168 when he fought Canelo than Crawford does. Right? We saw where when they arrived in Vegas, Canelo's cheered, Crawford's booed. Right? Lay on that the fact that The fight's in Vegas, right? Canelo, history with the city, where he's been in huge fights in Las Vegas. And of course, it's a Mexican holiday. So, I've mentioned this many times. I know people disagree. But Crawford is going to have to do something to tell us that Canelo's, not Crawford's, Canelo's 4 titles need to change hands. Right? As I've put it diplomatically in an earlier video, he needs a 9th round like Usyk had against Fury the first fight. That's what it takes for boxing to change course and to take a major champion's title. Right? So Crawford coming up 3 weight classes against a guy who's been in the ring with punchers like Golovkin, right? That's 3 fights. Right? James Kirkland, southpaw. We're all speculating on whether Crawford's going to go southpaw. I believe he's going to have to go southpaw, and he's going to have to be back foot. Just understand, the Canelo-Kirkland fight opens with Kirkland getting Canelo, and Kirkland, southpaw slugger, getting Canelo in a corner. Look at the first round of that fight. Right? Canelo today says that Kirkland, of all his opponents, hit him the hardest. Canelo has his back up against the ropes. That fight only goes a few more rounds. Canelo with his back up against the ropes is kind of like Salvador Sanchez with his back up against the ropes. Canelo was comfortable. That's against a bigger puncher than Crawford. I believe that fight's at 160. A weight class Crawford has never fought. Right? So, folks, the tip-off on the fight, the tip-off on what the actual odds should be, will be the late money. Right? I believe you have a group out there. Right? Gamblers don't advertise themselves. I believe you have a group out there quietly waiting for this line to adjust. Right? I believe this group is hoping to maximize value. They're hoping that some money comes on Crawford. Maybe there's a colorful weigh-in. Right? Maybe fans will be fooled by the visual, by the weight, rather than the reality, which is that Crawford is fighting 3 weight classes above his fight against Errol Spence. Understand, at the time of the Spence fight, Crawford was on a knockout streak. That streak was snapped as soon as Crawford made it to 154. I want you to look at the Madrimov fight, revisit it. Forget what's said, let's go by what the fighters do. In the comment section of this video, tell us the round in that Madrimov fight where you felt that Terence Crawford was going for the knockout. Right, folks? Madrimov comes deep in the pocket. Right? If I fault Madrimov for anything in that fight, it's that Madrimov, who fights in a herky-jerky moment, kept backing out of the pocket. Right, folks? Crawford relies on a jab in that fight. He knew he couldn't stop Madrimov. He figured that out during the fight, didn't he? Right, folks? Am I supposed to believe that at 168 against a guy who has never been stopped as a professional, right, has never been stopped as a professional, that there is any risk, 3 weight classes up from the Spence fight, of Crawford getting a stoppage? Folks, Crawford's not getting a stoppage in this fight. Crawford's not going to have the fans behind him in this fight. Right? So let's just say what Crawford needs to do is he can't even wait until the 9th round. Think of crowd dynamics here. He's going to have to take the crowd out of the fight early. Right? Early. Let me just say, too, life's unfair. There are some fighters who can be back foot and know how to frame it. Right? The guy is letting you know, look, I'm on my back foot and you can't find me. I'm aggressive enough where I'm giving you enough of a fight where people believe I earn it. Right? This isn't a William Skull situation. Think about Bivol again against Canelo. We've seen that fight. Right? Bivol, charismatic. As Bivol backs up, and Bivol, when he's coming forward, believe it or not, it's a combination puncher. You actually saw that in the Gilberto Ramirez fight. But Bivol on his back foot, and we've seen this in the Beterbiev fights, Bivol on his back foot is charismatic. You see him showing you that he's making the other guy miss. Right? Guys who can frame a back foot. Right? The Alis of the world, where you throw the punch and Ali's leaning back, he has his hands low and stuff like that. You're suddenly in the ring with the guy. You understand, it takes a certain level of charisma to fight the kind of fight that Crawford is gonna have to fight to win it. Right? He's gonna have to be on his back foot. He's gonna have to be, making Canelo miss. He's gonna have to be teaching us what a crisp counter is. You're going to have to watch the fight and you're going to have to think to yourself, Canelo's out of his depth. Now, Canelo has fought some great boxers. Right? Erislandy Lara, great boxer. Danny Jacobs, great boxer. Folks, Danny Jacobs had problems landing his jab against Canelo. Think about that. Right? One of the people picking Canelo in this fight is Jacobs' trainer, Andre Rozier. Jacobs physically bigger than Terence Crawford. Right? And so, I don't know how else to put it. I believe the tip-off on what's going to happen in this fight is going to reveal itself between now and the fight. You're going to have big money, in my opinion, coming in on the Canelo side of the ledger. Watch Crawford's line. Right? This is going to be binary. Either it happens or it doesn't. In my opinion, by the time this fight starts, I'm expecting Crawford to be at least a plus 165 or a plus 170. In other words, the fight right now, giving Crawford a 40% chance of winning the fight, is mispriced. Right? Gamblers who follow the sport closely, who are trying to get an edge on the casino, know that there's a huge difference between 147, the highest weight class at which Crawford had fought before his last fight, against 154. Right? There's a huge difference between 147 and 168. And nothing politically goes Crawford's way. Right? Gamblers don't even have to speculate on who's the more popular fighter in Vegas. All they had to do was listen as the fighters were announced at their grand arrivals. Right, the Canelo side of the ledger, people are cheering. Everyone's cheering. The Crawford side of the ledger isn't even disinterest. They openly booed him. Right, folks? Allegiant Stadium is indoors. Right? The booing is going to resonate. Understand, Crawford can't wait until the 9th round. Because if the action until then isn't a dynamic that favors him, there's a possibility that by the time you get to the 9th round, Canelo will already have bagged 6 rounds. Right? Let me say too, Max Kellerman had a mic. He's questioning Crawford. And he says to Crawford, words to the effect of, hey man, clear you're getting booed. Right? How are you going to offset the boos? And Crawford said a line that many have said in boxing. You know, the line was, hey man, you know, the crowd can't jump in the ring and help him beat me. Right, folks? That line doesn't work in Las Vegas. Because everyone, including the judges, know who the incumbent is. Right, so folks, less than 48 hours before the fight, I'm just telling you, in my opinion, and we'll see if I'm right. Again, it's binary. Either it happens and I'm right, or it doesn't happen and I'm wrong. Right now, Crawford's a plus 150. I believe the late money is going to be on Canelo, where Crawford's going to jump to at least a plus 165, plus 170. What that'll tell you is that hardcore boxing gamblers know Crawford hasn't even fought the best at 154. Right? Madrimov, promising fighter. He's not Murtazaliev. He's not the towering inferno, Sebastian Fundora. Crawford hasn't fought anybody at 160. Right? Janabek. Boxing fans need to know these names because it impacts the credibility of this fight. Crawford didn't fight Janabek. Crawford didn't fight Carlos Adames. Right? Crawford hasn't fought anybody at 168. Right? Diego Pacheco, know his name. As you watch the undercard, which is a brilliant undercard, look at Christian and Billy, look at Lester Martinez, look at Callum Walsh, even look at Fernando Vargas Jr. Crawford hasn't fought any of them. Right? I need for folks to think about the entry point of Alexander Usyk, a guy who moved up in weight, a guy who conquered the heavier weight class. Think about the entry point of him into the heavyweight division. Right, folks? He fought Witherspoon. He fought Chisora. Right? He fights Joshua. He fights Dubois. He fights Fury. In other words, folks, it's a slow roll. It's a slow build. By the time he gets to Tyson Fury, he knows he can handle heavyweight power because he not only has been in the ring with heavyweight punchers, not just Joshua, but also Chisora, but he's also been under fire in the division. Derek Chisora jumps on him, doesn't he? Right? It's not like Usyk's in there trying to find Chisora. No, Chisora finds him early. So by the time Usyk is fighting Fury, Usyk knows he could be jumped on and he can survive. Right? He knows that already. Does Terence Crawford know that? Let me close by just mentioning something that I know most people disagree with, and that's cool. That's why I'm mentioning it. Right? You look at a Joe Frazier, and that's really who Canelo is. Right? You look at a Joe Frazier, and this is a guy who was not that big. Right? But Joe Frazier came up at heavyweight. He's fighting rough and tumble guys. Right? He's fighting Oscar Bonavena, for crying out loud. Before he fights Ali, he fights Ali's stablemate, Jimmy Ellis. Right? Let's remember, Dundee in the corner of both Ali and Ellis. When Ellis fights Ali, Dundee's in Ellis's corner. Right? Understand, Joe Frazier, he was a heavyweight. Don't worry about the scale. Don't worry about the size of the guys. Right? He fights Bob Foster, major puncher. Right? Hall of Famer. Bob Foster, the light heavyweight champion's physically bigger than him. In terms of height, Foster looks like he has the broader shoulders. It's Joe on his front foot. Who cares what they look like standing next to each other? Right? It's Joe whose nickname is Smoking Joe. Now here it is, Canelo. Right, folks? Unlike Crawford, who hasn't fought, current day, top of 154, top of 160, top of 168. Right? Unlike Crawford, Canelo has been in the ring against James Kirkland. I believe that fight was in Texas. Right? Canelo has been in the ring, and in my opinion, the first fight against Gennady Golovkin goes south on him. Canelo's on his back foot for rounds in that fight. It's clear Golovkin's too big for him. But understand, Canelo survives that fight, gets a draw. Canelo then gets the rematch. Folks, that's the mindset we're talking about. Right? Canelo is awarded the decision in the rematch. I thought the rematch could have gone for Golovkin, but that's okay. Right? Canelo fought him courageously. I'm telling you, at the beginning of that fight, I was in a bar, and we were speechless at the beginning of that fight. Canelo's on his front foot against Golovkin. Let me say, too, not all undisputeds are the same. Some guys get undisputed by fighting guys who have multiple belts. Right? Nothing wrong with that. They've earned the undisputed. Canelo shows up at 168. His idea of becoming undisputed is fighting each of the 4 champions. Folks, it was decentralized. So my point to you is, as Canelo looks across the ring at Crawford, and I know Crawford, has a good steer, and I know Bomac comes across as confident. He's good at portraying that. But as Canelo looks across at Crawford, it's just going to be like Joe Frazier looking across at Ali. Folks, when they were unbeaten, understand that first fight is not close. Right? Forget the fact that Joe knocks down Ali. Joe wins at least 10 rounds. When you have time, just revisit that fight. What I want people to do is to look closely at the first round. Frazier's going for the knockout in the first round. Doesn't matter that Ali's an Olympic gold medalist. Doesn't matter that Ali beats Sonny Liston twice. Doesn't matter that Ali beats Bonavena, who had knocked down Joe Frazier twice. Frazier gets up and wins the fight. They're both unbeaten. Folks, Joe Frazier has no doubt in his mind that if he lands, this fight's a done deal. He's loading up on left hooks in the first round. Frazier is not bashful against Ali from the opening bell. That's Canelo. So Crawford, his path to victory, and I'm not saying it's impossible, right? There's a certain style that can beat Canelo. We saw it with Bivol, right? I believe if J.O. Bataya was Canelo's weight, J.O. Bataya could beat Canelo, right? There's a certain type of boxer puncher on his back foot who can take advantage of Canelo's legs, which aren't the best. I concede that openly here. But just understand, right? Crawford doesn't frame the back foot the way those guys do, right? I think Prime Roy Jones could beat Canelo, right? But Prime Roy Jones had a certain charisma level, right? Here you're talking about a guy who is untested, and I'm understating it, untested at 168, right? He's fighting Canelo. I know there are those, I myself am extremely impressed when I see an ambidextrous fighter, right? There are those who say, oh, Crawford has an element of surprise. Oh, he could switch and stuff like that. He won't be able to switch in this fight, folks. Canelo hits too hard. Understand, there's no margin of error for Crawford. If he gets hit flush with a Canelo left hook, in my opinion, this fight is over. Right? If Canelo gets in the pocket, folks, he's going to stay in the pocket. You don't believe me? Look at Canelo. I believe the fight's in New York City against Rocky Fielding, the first champion he faced at 168. Folks, it's a Joe Frazier mindset. Canelo has no doubt at all that he could handle Rocky Fielding at 168. Right? After the skull fight, I'm sure Canelo, Eddie Reynoso, his trainer, are talking about the fact that Canelo has to move his feet more. So Canelo is going to be looking for Terence Crawford. Crawford's going to have to be on his back foot. He's going to have to put on enough of a show where at the end of the fight, 2 of the 3 judges are going to think to themselves, he did enough to take Canelo's 4 belts. Right, folks? I'll be surprised if Crawford goes off at a plus 165 or better. I'll be surprised. He's at a plus 150 now. I think casual fans have bid him down to a plus 150 when he hasn't fought the guys Canelo has fought. He hasn't tested himself at 165. He hasn't tested himself at 160. Right? So watch the betting market. That's going to be the canary in the gold mine. If suddenly there's a bunch of late money that comes in on Canelo, you're going to know that hardcore people watching boxing, the kind who bet late, the kind who wait for things like weigh-ins to make sure that when Canelo shows up, it looks like he trained. Right? You don't want to see a guy and then think to yourself, man, this guy is looking soft. You don't want this to be an Adrian Broner, Johan Guzman type of weigh-in. Right? You want to see that the guy is serious and stuff like that. The minute they see that Canelo, who's been sparring with people like Jaron Ennis, has shown up, isn't taking this fight lightly, views this as a legacy fight, realizes that his brand in Vegas against an unbeaten fighter on a Mexican holiday depends on him coming in looking crisp. Once the gamblers see that, once they realize they've gotten all the juice, odds-wise, out of casual fans looking at highlights of Crawford at 140 against Yorkis Gamboa, right? That fight turns on an uppercut. Crawford's getting tested before the uppercut. Cannot handle Gamboa's hand speed, right? Once people realize that they're looking at highlights of Crawford at 147, once they look at the history of Crawford lines and realize that it's absurd for a Canelo opponent who has never fought at 160 or 168 to be getting a plus 150, to be given a 40% chance of winning this fight. Once they also look at some other Crawford fights and ask themselves tough questions like, what exactly was the scoring on my personal scorecard before Crawford knocks down Sean Porter? Isn't that a close fight going into the later rounds? Right? What was the scoring in the fight Crawford against Jose Benavidez, David Benavidez' brother? Right, folks? That fight was highly competitive. Highly competitive going into the later rounds. Right? That's Crawford at 147. Now he's fighting at 168 against a guy who's never been dropped. Folks, watch the lines. Crawford plus 150 as I make this video. It's 9:18 a.m. Pacific time on the Friday before the Saturday Crawford-Canelo fight. Watch the lines. If you see Crawford jumping, I'm telling you, the late money tends to be pros, not Joes. Right? The Joes hear the fight. They're fans of Terrence Crawford's. They say, oh man, he is a great fighter. What? I'm getting Crawford at underdog odds? Canelo hasn't been stopping guys of late, even though he's been knocking down most of the guys who aren't running like Skull. You know, I'm going to be on the Crawford side of the ledger. Right? The Joes are thinking about, wow, well, who has Crawford fought at 160? The answer is no one. Who has Crawford fought at 168? The answer is no one. You don't ask those questions of Canelo because there are too many dudes Canelo's fought. Right? And of course, the fact that Canelo has a punch that can stop a 175-pound champion like Kovalev says it all. Right? Kovalev, who of course beat Anthony Yard, right, himself has been in with punchers, gets stopped by Canelo. Right? Watch the lines. That's the canary in the goal line, in the coal mine. I'm expecting the odds on Crawford to jump as gamblers realize Canelo should be an even bigger favorite in this fight. That's how I see it. I think Canelo wins the fight. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. I hope you leave them in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let me add one more thought here. You know, when I first was looking at films, when I didn't have the awareness to actually consider weight classes, I was very impressed with what Crawford's doing in the ring. The truth is, Crawford's one of the best fighters I've ever seen. He's an obvious first ballot Hall of Famer. He is a great fighter. Right? He is a great fighter. When they interview trainers, Crawford's a trainer's dream, because Crawford can fight different styles. You heard me say that Crawford's ambidextrous. Understand, Crawford not only can switch, but Crawford's feet are flawless. In other words, he's fighting at righty. You think, oh, he must be a righty. Then you see him switch to lefty, and he's as fluid. Right? He's better at switching than Tyson Fury. You see Crawford, you heard me mention the Yorkis-Gamboa fight. That's an important fight to look at. That's Crawford getting tested at 140. And Crawford changes that fight off an uppercut. Crawford's punch selection is hard to mess with. He's fighting Kell Brook, who had a distinct hand speed advantage in the early rounds over Errol Spence. Right, folks? Errol Spence is a bystander in the early rounds against Kell Brook. Brook is that much faster than him. Right? Look at Kell Brook against Golovkin. The first 2 rounds, Golovkin realizes he can't do anything with Kell Brook's hand speed. Right? In the middle of the fight against Crawford, which doesn't go that long, right? Crawford gets the stoppage. But in the middle of the fight against Crawford actually changes hands against that level of hand speed. You're watching the fight, it's so shocking that you're looking at the fight and you're thinking, what the hell is Crawford doing? That's how good he is. So I get the level of respect, right? When they talk to a trainer is going to say things like, Crawford's a great fighter, right? Crawford, master of a lot of styles, right? Of course, at the end of the interview, the trainer is going to say, but the weight gap's significant, right, folks? The weight gap is more than significant. The weight gap, coupled with the lack of experience at 160 and 168, in my opinion, is almost insurmountable. Right? Fluke things are going to have to happen. Right? Crawford's going to, Canelo has to get cut like Vitaly Klitschko. Right? Things like this happen in boxing. Vitaly Klitschko against Lennox Lewis. Right? Canelo's going to have to get cut. Canelo's going to have, something's going to happen. I've seen a fight before, too, where, a guy, hurts his knee, can't continue, hurts a shoulder. Something's going to have to happen outside of the normal Canelo fight for Crawford to even have an outside chance. I think it's too much of a hurdle to overcome. Canelo, excellent fighter, on the pound-for-pound list if you take out the weight. Defensively blessed. This isn't the guy just relying off power. This is a technician. Expect the odds on Crawford to get to at least plus 165. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Enjoy the fight. I'll be on after the fight with my thoughts. If Crawford wins, it's a special moment for boxing. If Crawford looks good and the fight's close enough where we're questioning the decision, that'll be a major feather in Crawford's hat as well. Right? Just understand, Canelo has already fought an undisputed champion who was actually undisputed at a higher weight class than Crawford ever was. Right? Undisputed at 154, a division where Crawford only had a cup of coffee against one fighter. Right? Jermell Charlo. That's one of the best Canelo fights ever. Canelo shows foot speed in that fight, folks. Canelo comes across the ring. Right? Even if Jermell Charlo didn't hit the canvas, and where does he hit the canvas? Over by the ropes. Canelo's not giving him air to breathe. But just understand, Canelo came in, Canelo was energized, he understood the moment. Even if Charlo didn't hit the canvas in that fight, that was a dominant Canelo performance. If you want the truth on this fight, look at Jermell Charlo interviews now. He flatly calls Canelo an ox. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours. Thanks for stopping by.